Quilt Co. I'm Danae. Today we are going to talk about different ways to make half square triangles and how to decide which technique to use based on your specific project. Half square triangles, or more commonly referred to in patterns as HSTs, are one of the most common blocks used in quilting and is one you'll encounter often. I'm going to show you how to make HSTs 4 different ways. 1 at a time, 2 at a time, 4 at a time, and 8 at a time. Square sizes will vary based on your project, so for these examples, I'm focusing on the technique and not the specific measurements. If you're not already familiar, a half square triangle is a square block unit that is created when 2 triangles have been sewn together along their diagonal side. You can see here that each triangle creates half of the square unit. There are many ways to make half square triangles, and the method that's going to work best for you is going to depend largely on how many squares your pattern is calling for and what size fabric you're working with. If you wanted just 1 half square triangle, for instance, you would start with 2 squares the size you want your HST to be. For this example, I have 2.5-inch squares. On the back side of the lighter fabric, you're going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. Put your squares together, right sides together, and head to the sewing machine and sew directly onto the line that you drew. Once you've sewn on that line, you're now ready to cut 1/4 inch away from that seam. After you've done that, you press to the dark side and you have your HST. If you're making large SHTs, or if you're trying to fussy cut and have a lot of control over where the prints are, this might be the best method for you. The biggest downsides to this method are that it leaves quite a bit of fabric wasted and can be very slow if you're needing to make a lot of the half square triangles. Accurate cutting and sewing is always very important, but even more so with these HST units. Because I am unfortunately not a perfect cutter or sewer 100% of the time, try as I might, I like to make my SHTs a little bigger so that I can trim them down the exact size that I want. If you don't feel like you need that wiggle room, that's awesome. But for me, I find I just get way more frustrated trying to get them to be the perfect size than I do with the extra time it takes me to trim them down. So I always add 1/4 inch to whatever the chart says the size I need the squares to be. But do whatever works best for you. Another important thing to understand is the difference between a finished and unfinished HST unit. The finished size is the size the block will be once you've pieced it into the quilt after all 4 sides have been sewn with a 1/4 inch seam. What you need to pay the most attention to is the unfinished size of your HST unit. This is the size you want your block to be trimmed down to before you start piecing your unit together. So for instance, this half square triangle is 1 3/4 inches. And once it's sewn into a pillow or a quilt, it's going to be 1 1/4 inches. For the 2 at a time method, we are going to start out with our 2 fabric squares. On the lighter of the 2, we're going to draw our diagonal line from corner to corner. We're going to put our fabrics right sides together. And then we're going to head to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch away on both sides, giving us a unit that looks like this. At this point, we're going to cut directly on the line that we drew, giving us 2 half square triangles, at which point we'll press to the dark side and we'll end up with 2 blocks just like this. Because I always add 1/4 inch to my original starting square size, I need to trim this down. My favorite way to trim half square triangles is with a lock block ruler. So at this point, I would hook my lock block ruler on and go ahead and cut Then turn it to the other side. Lock my lock block ruler on again. Line it up with the 2.5 inch mark. And cut. And there I have a perfect 2.5 inch half square triangle using the 2 at a time method. This method is great if you don't have a ton of blocks to make or if you're making really, really large blocks. When making HSTs 4 at a time, we're again gonna start with our 2 squares of fabric. We're gonna put them together, right sides facing each other, and we're gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam along all 4 sides, creating a unit like this. Once we've sewn on all 4 sides, we're gonna cut 2 cuts, 1 on each diagonal, and it is gonna give us 4 units. At this point, I would press to the dark side and then trim down my block to the size that I wanted it to be. 4 at a time has one major downside, and that is that it gives you bias edges, which can really be an issue because it's very stretchy, which will make it hard to keep your unit flat and square. You really have to be careful if you choose to go with this method, and while it does give you 4 at a time, it has never been my preferred method of making HSTs. The 8 at a time method is without question my very favorite when it comes to making a lot of HSTs. It's fast, and of course the best part is that you don't have to fuss with the bias edges. So grab your 2 fabric squares. On the lighter one this time, we're gonna draw 2 diagonal lines to where they intersect in the middle, and we're gonna sew 4 lines, 1 on each side of the lines we drew. It's going to look like this. Let me flip it over so you can see it a little better with your 4 lines. Now we're ready to cut. I like to cut this way first and then this way. That way, once those cuts are made, if anything shifts, it's not a big deal because I have my lines that I can use for reference to cut the other 2 ways. So here they are, all cut and separated, and here we have 8 units. So now at this point, I would press them all to the dark side. And because I always make mine a little bit bigger so that I can trim them down, I'm now ready to trim them down to 2.5 inches so they'll look just like this. Perfect HSTs every single time. Some of my favorite quilts have been made using half square triangles, like this Lottie quilt by Penelope Handmade. HSTs are a great technique to get good at in quilting because you're gonna see them time and time again. I would love to know what your favorite technique is when making half square triangles, and also if a sizing chart with that extra 1/4 inch built in would be helpful, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. See y'all next time.